The storm howled through the wilderness, smothering the mountainside in snow and silence. Wind slammed against the cabin's log walls with furious intent, but inside, Jack Carter sat motionless in his chair, cocooned in the soft flicker of firelight. The hearth cracked and sighed, its warmth the only voice in days of isolation. A mug of black coffee steamed faintly in his hands, though he wasn't drinking. Just holding on to the silence had become a companion in itself. Retired life offered Jack solitude he once thought he needed, but the storm had shifted that into something. A third scratch came, this time accompanied by a muffled, high-pitched whimper. He stood. No rush, just a sudden inner gravity pulling him toward the front door. The cabin creaked beneath his feet as he approached, every sound amplified by the blanket of sound. The frosted window by the door revealed nothing but the blinding swirl of the blizzard, until it didn't. There, barely visible through the blur of snow and shadow, stood a German shepherd. Her form was hunched low, pressed hard against the glass. Her coat was frosted over, eyes hollow with fatigue. But it wasn't just her. Two tiny shapes huddled beneath her. Puppies. She was shielding them with what little strength she had left, her ribs outlined sharply beneath matted fur, her breath fogging the pain in shallow bursts. Her eyes met Jack's, pleading, exhausted, but alive. His hand hovered over the knob. He knew what opening the door could mean: trouble, illness, chaos. But something deep in his chest, something old and human and aching, moved. "What the hell happened to you?" he whispered. Then, without ceremony, he opened the door. The wind screamed inside like a feral thing, whipping the flames and numbing Jack's face in an instant. The dog didn't move. She stood firm, her front paws half buried in snow, her body braced like a wall around the shivering pups. "Come on, girl," Jack said softly, crouching low so his voice wouldn't carry threat. "Get in here. You'll freeze to death out there." She let out a low, uncertain whimper, turning to glance at her young before inching forward. One pup stumbled. She gently picked it up by the scruff, carrying it inside. The second followed, slipping and wobbling across the threshold. Only when both pups were inside did the mother step fully into the room. Jack shut the door behind them with a heavy thud, sealing out the blizzard's roar. The stillness returned, except now it pulsed with something raw and new. The dog trembled violently, her body shocked by the sudden warmth. Jack moved carefully, pulling an old wool blanket from the couch and kneeling beside her. She flinched as he reached forward, her muscles taut and ready to bolt. But he didn't touch her. Not yet. He just draped the blanket nearby, letting it fall gently over her back, and the puppies curled beside her. Her head snapped toward him, eyes sharp with warning. But when he didn't come closer, she let out a long, exhausted sigh and collapsed into a curled ball beside the fire. Jack lowered himself slowly to the floor, just outside her reach. He watched her eyes, still wide, still alert, as they tracked his every motion. The pups were no more than a handful of fur each, their bodies twitching faintly in sleep or dream. One let out a soft squeak and burrowed closer to its mother's belly. She growled low when Jack's hand inched forward. Not a threat, just a boundary. "Okay," he murmured, pulling back. "You're still on edge. That's fair." He stood and crossed to the kitchen, trying to slow his racing thoughts. His boots clunked dully on the wooden floor. He rummaged through cabinets until he found an old metal bowl, filled it with warm water, and returned. Without eye contact, without pressure, he placed it nearby. The mother stared at the bowl for a long moment before inching forward. Her tongue flicked once, testing, then twice. Then she drank, fast, ragged gulps. She trusts just enough to survive, Jack thought. Back in his armchair, he sat and stared, not at her, but the fire, his gaze unfocused, his jaw tight. The pups were barely moving. Their sides rose and fell with the softest effort, fragile and small as matchsticks. He'd been a firefighter for 3 decades, seen collapsed roofs and broken bodies, families clinging to each other in smoke. But this tiny creature who had carried 2 newborns through a blizzard, this was something else. And he didn't know what the hell to do. He let her be that night, didn't try to touch her again, just stoked the fire, laid out extra towels by the hearth, and left a bowl of softened dog food near her, without comment. She didn't eat it right away, but he noticed the food gone by midnight. At one point, Jack woke from a light doze to see her watching him, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the fire, expression unreadable. Then she lowered her head and rested it on her paws, a signal, not trust, not yet, but something softer, permission. The storm raged on outside, battering against the world with icy fists, but within the cabin, a pocket of warmth held steady, the kind that builds, not explodes, the kind that waits. And Jack, wrapped in a worn flannel blanket, made himself a quiet promise. "You're safe now," he said aloud, not knowing if she understood, but hoping she did. "I won't let anything happen to you." The shepherd shifted slightly at his voice. Her tail twitched once, a single tired wag. Morning broke gently, the storm's fury giving way to a cold hush. Light filtered through the window panes, casting a pale glow across the wooden floor. Snow lay deep and untouched outside, but inside, the fire still smoldered. Jack stirred in his chair, his back stiff from sleeping upright. His first thought wasn't of coffee or the cold. It was of them. He turned his head slowly. The shepherd was still there, curled tightly around her pups. One of the little ones had wriggled its way beneath her foreleg, a tuft of white fur, barely visible. She hadn't moved much during the night, but her eyes opened the moment Jack did. They met his, cautious but clearer now. Less fear, more watching. "Morning, girl," Jack said softly, his voice cracked from disuse. She didn't growl this time. That felt like progress. He moved to the kitchen and opened the pantry, scanning shelves for anything edible. Most of what he had was meant for one man alone. Cans, beans, dry goods. He found a dusty tin of chicken soup, not gourmet, but warm and nourishing. "I'll get you something better soon," he mumbled, as if she could hear and judge him. He heated the soup on the stove and poured it into a bowl, careful to let it cool before placing it near her. She didn't move at first, only sniffed the air and blinked slowly. But when the warmth reached her nose, she sat up and began to eat. Carefully, but without hesitation. Her pups stirred at the motion. One cried softly, another made a valiant attempt to crawl. Jack crouched nearby, entranced. The fragility of their movements pierced something tender in him. "You're a tough one," he murmured, watching her lick the last of the broth from the bowl. "Carrying those pups through that storm. You deserve a break." She looked at him then, and this time, there was no suspicion, only a long, unreadable stare. He didn't look away. He wanted her to see he meant it. After she finished, she licked her pups clean with slow, deliberate strokes. Her ribs still stood out beneath her coat, but her body language had shifted. She was more grounded now, less on edge. Not relaxed, but present. Jack made a decision. He pulled out his phone and dialed the local vet clinic. When the receptionist answered, he didn't waste time. "This is Jack Carter," he said. "I've got a German Shepherd and her 2 pups here. They're in rough shape. Can you see them today?" The receptionist's voice was warm. "Of course, Mr. Carter. We'll squeeze you in this afternoon. Bring them over." Jack ended the call and looked at the mother dog. "You hear that, girl? We're gonna get you some help." She tilted her head at the tone of his voice, not confused, just listening. Getting them to the truck was no small task. Jack retrieved an old quilt from the closet, thick and faded, but clean, and laid it out gently on the floor. He approached her slowly, kneeling down and speaking softly. "I need to move you, just to get you some help. That's all." She didn't understand the words, but something in his tone, steady, low, careful, kept her still. He reached for the edge of the blanket. The moment his hands brushed near the pups, she growled, a low, warning sound that vibrated in the stillness. Jack froze. "Okay," he whispered, palms up. "I get it. I'd growl too." He sat there for a while, letting her adjust. Minutes passed. He didn't move again until she shifted her body slightly, as if giving just a sliver of permission. He took it gently, lifting the edge of the blanket, bundling the pups first with delicate hands, then urging her to follow. She hesitated. Then, eyes fixed on her babies, she stepped onto the quilt herself. Jack exhaled slowly. He carried the bundled family to the truck, laying them gently across the back seat and packing towels around them like a nest. The pups whimpered softly. The mother curled around them, never once taking her eyes off Jack. The road into town was slick, rimmed with icy shoulders and the lingering teeth of the storm. Jack drove slow, both hands white-knuckled on the wheel. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror often, not to check the road behind him, but to see her. She didn't sleep, didn't rest. She simply watched. At the clinic, the warmth of the building enveloped them in artificial comfort. The smell of antiseptic and animals hit immediately. A vet tech came forward, and Jack explained the situation with as few words as possible. "Found her on my porch last night," he said. "She carried those pups through a blizzard." Dr. Monroe, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and worn boots, examined the mother gently. "She's severely underweight," she said, brushing her hands over the dog's ribs. "But she's strong. And the pups, well, they're lucky she made it this far." Jack stood nearby, silent, fists jammed into his coat pockets. When the exam was over, Dr. Monroe looked up. "Do you know where she came from?" Jack shook his head. "She just showed up, half frozen." "Well," the vet said, her voice softening, "she picked the right door. They gave her fluids, cleaned the pup's eyes, and sent them back with a small bag of food and some antibiotics." Jack thanked them quietly and carried the bundle back to his truck. This time, she leaned into him just a little as he set her down. The cabin was warmer now, not just from the fire Jack kept carefully tended, but from something else. A shift in atmosphere, a heartbeat he hadn't felt in years. The shepherd lay curled by the hearth, her body no longer trembling with cold, but with fatigue. The pups, he'd begun calling them Snow and Ash, slept pressed against her belly, tiny tails twitching in dreams. Jack watched them from the armchair, a book in his lap left unopened. He didn't need to read. He needed to be here. He didn't know what had made him say the name out loud that morning, but it had stuck. "Grace," he had whispered to her. And when she turned her head, ears twitching as if she recognized something in it, he repeated it again. "You look like a Grace to me." She didn't flinch. Later that day, she'd let him sit a little closer, still tense, still wary, but her body had not braced to flee. Her eyes followed him, with more curiosity than caution. At one point, when Snow tumbled awkwardly away from her, Jack reached to help, and Grace had allowed it. A test, one he passed. It was slow, it was subtle, but it was progress. Each day he sat on the floor beside them, not reaching, not speaking much, just being still, letting her learn him like a sound or a scent, letting her measure him in silence. Grace began to rest her head near his boots, then closer. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, she sighed, not from pain or fear, but from something like release. By the end of the week, she let him stroke her head, once, gently, behind the ears. It was like touching a thunderstorm after it passed, the silence left behind, the gravity of what it had endured. The pups grew stronger, teetering around the cabin on unsteady legs. They yipped and pounced and curled up in Jack's flannel shirts. Their warmth filled the space in ways he hadn't known he missed. The quiet he'd once loved now seemed emptier by comparison. One night, as snow fell again, but softer this time, Jack sat on the floor beside them all, his back against the couch, the firelight dancing across the walls. Grace was nearby, her breathing steady. Her head rested on her paws, but her eyes occasionally lifted to check the pups. Jack smiled at the sight. "You've got some tough little ones there, Grace," he said softly. She looked at him, not past him, not through him, at him, and her eyes held something unmistakable this time: trust. As the days passed, the edges of their world softened. Grace's coat, once dull and brittle, began to thicken and shine. The sharp ridges of her ribs faded beneath slow, steady meals. Jack brushed her gently now, just once or twice a day, enough to help remove the dead fur and loosen the scars. She never pulled away anymore. The pups, tiny, clumsy whirlwinds, had found their legs. Snow was bold and curious, forever darting under furniture or chewing the corners of the rug. Ash, smaller and quieter, preferred curling into Jack's flannel shirts by the fire, but even he had begun to play, awkwardly pouncing on his sister with growls that sounded more like hiccups. Jack began waking up early again, not because he had to, because he wanted to. He'd stopped setting alarms years ago, but now his eyes opened before sunrise, instinct pushing him toward the hearth, where Grace and her pups slept. He'd stoke the fire, refill their bowls, and sit with his coffee in silence, watching the first light paint gold across the cabin floor. He'd lived alone for almost 10 years, and yet, this didn't feel like a crowd. It felt full, complete. Grace now met him at the door when he came in from gathering wood. Her tail wagged, just once or twice, but it wagged, and she'd nudge his hand with her nose before circling back to her pups. That small gesture, unspectacular on the surface, meant everything. It meant she saw him not just as a safe harbor, but as part of the pack. One evening, as dusk crept in and snow tapped at the window panes, Jack sat cross-legged near the fire. The pups were asleep in a pile beside him, their warm little bodies pressed against his thigh. Grace approached, slow and deliberate. She paused inches from him, eyes searching his face. He didn't move, didn't speak. And then, with quiet dignity, she lay down beside him, resting her head on his knee. Jack froze. The weight of her trust was heavier than anything he'd lifted in his working years. His hand moved on its own, fingers sinking gently into the fur behind her ears. She didn't flinch. She leaned in. The silence between them was full, not with fear or doubt, but with something rare and sacred. Peace, born from shared survival. As the fire crackled and the wind whispered outside, Jack let his hand rest on Grace's head. They didn't need words. They had breath. They had warmth. They had each other. Winter softened its grip. The wind no longer howled so viciously, and the snow that once buried the world in silence began to thin and retreat. Slush gave way to frozen ground, and the sky above the mountains brightened to a weary gray instead of steel. Inside the cabin, peace had become a quiet rhythm. Each morning, Jack woke to the sound of little paws scampering across wood. Snow and Ash were relentless in their exploration, chasing dust motes and tumbling over each other with squeaky yips. Grace often lay nearby, eyes half closed, ears twitching at every bark and bump, her body finally carrying softness again. Jack watched it all from the kitchen counter, sipping coffee, heart fuller than he ever thought possible in old age. But even peace carries shadows. It started small, an unease Jack couldn't name, a flicker in Grace's posture, the way her ears would perk not toward the pups, but toward the door, a stillness in her body when the wind changed. Jack saw it. At first he tried to ignore it. She'd come far. She was safe. The storm was behind them. But Grace hadn't forgotten. Her body remembered what her voice never could. That afternoon, Jack bundled up and opened the front door for the first time since the blizzard. Snow still clung to the earth, but patches of muddy ground peeked through. Sunlight spilled across the porch, tentative and cold. "Come on, girl," he called gently. "Let's get some fresh air." Grace stepped out first, cautious but willing. Her pups waddled after her, their paws sinking with every step. Snow let out a delighted bark and charged after a fluttering leaf. Ash trotted behind, sniffing everything with wide eyes. Jack watched from the porch, smiling, until Grace stopped. Her body went still, stone still. Her head lifted, ears erect, nose twitching furiously toward the tree line that bordered the clearing around the cabin. Jack followed her gaze, squinting into the woods. Nothing but trees, shadows, stillness. "What is it?" he asked. Grace growled, a sound deeper than any he'd heard from her before. Her hackles rose, and she stepped forward, positioning herself between the pups and the forest. Jack's chest tightened. She'd seen something, or remembered something. He scooped up the pups, their little bodies squirming in his arms, and guided Grace gently back toward the cabin. She didn't resist, but she didn't look away from the woods either. Back inside, Jack closed and bolted the door. He pulled the curtain shut and sat on the floor beside her. Grace paced, her body tight as a wire. Even as Snow and Ash curled up beside her, her gaze stayed locked on the door. Jack reached out, brushing her fur with a steady hand. "You're not just spooked," he murmured. "You've seen this before." That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, the rifle he hadn't touched in years resting against the wall beside him. Grace lay at his feet, stiff as if she too had decided that rest was no longer safe. Every creak in the wood, every rustle of wind sent her ears flicking, her muscles coiling. The pups, blissfully unaware, slept in a tight bundle by the fire. Jack stared into the dark, his gut twisted with questions. What did she see? Was it someone, something, or just memory? But the way she stood out there, rigid, growling, guarding, he knew it hadn't just been instinct. It had been recognition. By dawn, Jack had made a decision. He loaded Grace and the pups into the truck again and drove into town. Not to the vet this time, but to the local animal shelter. A modest, brick-front building run by volunteers, with tired smiles and careful eyes. At the front desk stood a woman named Sarah, her hair pulled back and sleeves rolled up. She looked up as Jack approached, a photo printed from his old camera in hand. "I found her outside my cabin," he explained. "She came out of the storm with 2 pups. I was wondering if anyone reported her missing, or if you recognize her." Sarah studied the picture for a long moment. Then she shook her head. "I don't recognize her," she said gently. "But dogs like her. We see them more often than we should." Jack's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Sarah's voice dropped a little. Backyard breeders. They use dogs like her until they're too old, too sick, or stop producing pups. Then they get dumped. Out here, it happens a lot more than people know. Remote enough that no one notices. Jack's throat tightened. You're saying she was thrown away? Sarah didn't answer. She didn't have to. Jack nodded slowly, his hand resting on Grace's back. She leaned against his leg now. That simple touch, solid, unflinching, was all the proof he needed. On the drive home, Jack said little. Grace sat beside him in the cab, her head out the window just enough to taste the air. The pups slept in a box lined with towels on the back seat. He kept glancing at her. Not because he was worried now, but because he was angry. They had thrown her away, but she had survived. And now? She was his. She had chosen his door, and that meant something. When they got home, Grace stepped out of the truck with purpose. Her tail wagged, faintly, but it wagged. She turned her face to the trees once more, and then turned back to him. You're safe now, Jack said aloud. No one's ever gonna hurt you again. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, Jack knew she understood every word. The days that followed carried a stillness Jack couldn't name. Grace grew more relaxed. Her pacing at night faded. She slept deeper, sometimes rolling onto her side with a soft sigh. The pups, now rounder and louder, filled the cabin with chaos, chewing table legs, toppling food bowls, barking at dust. Jack laughed more often, even talked to himself again, narrating breakfast routines like a man losing his mind, except he didn't feel lost anymore. He felt anchored. Yet still, in the quiet edges of the day, something lingered. One night, Jack sat by the window, the fire low and crackling, Grace curled at his side. The pups dozed nearby, tiny chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm. He was just about to close the curtain for the night when he saw it. A figure, motionless, standing at the edge of the woods. Jack's breath caught in his chest. He leaned forward, squinting. The shape was unmistakably human. Tall, unmoving, watching. Grace, he whispered. Her ears twitched. She rose slowly, eyes narrowing as she turned to the window. The moment her gaze locked on the figure, she growled. A deep, guttural sound Jack had only heard once before. The tension in the room snapped like a rubber band. Jack shut the curtain and reached for his phone. "This is Jack Carter," he said quickly, when the dispatcher answered. "There's someone outside my cabin. Been standing out there watching us." A promise was made. A deputy would come. But minutes stretched long. Jack's rifle sat on his lap now, old muscle memory guiding his breath. Grace stood beside the door, tail rigid, her body alert but not afraid. She remembered him. Whoever it was out there, she knew. When Deputy Miller arrived, tall, broad-shouldered, flashlight cutting through the trees, she searched the area thoroughly. Nothing. But she found tracks, human, deep, and tied to one tree, hidden behind a knot of brush, was a length of rope, fresh. Jack's gut twisted. Back inside, he bolted every lock and turned to Grace. She hadn't moved from the window. He knelt beside her, hand resting gently on her back. "He's not taking you back," Jack said. "I don't care who he is. You're mine now." Grace pressed her head against his chest, body trembling. Not from fear this time, but from memory. She knew who it was, and Jack, holding her close in the glow of firelight, made a vow he would not break. Morning arrived with an icy stillness. The sun rose behind pale clouds, casting gray light over a world dusted in frost. Jack barely slept. He sat in the armchair, rifle across his lap, Grace at his feet like a sentinel. Every sound outside, The crunch of a branch, the sigh of wind, spiked his pulse. He poured himself a half cup of coffee, hands unsteady. That's when Grace bolted upright. A low, rumbling growl rolled through her chest. She raced to the door, ears high, tail stiff, body vibrating. Jack froze. He reached for the rifle just as he pulled back the curtain an inch. And there he was, closer than before. A man, late 40s, weathered face, hood pulled low, a length of rope clutched in his hand. His eyes were dark, fixed on the door. Jack's heart kicked hard. He opened the door just a crack, rifle lowered, but ready. Grace stood rigid behind him. "Who's out there?" Jack called. "This is private land." The man stepped forward slowly. "That's my dog." His voice was calm, but it carried something dark beneath it. A practiced stillness. Jack narrowed his eyes. "She showed up nearly dead with 2 starving pups. If she's yours, you've got one hell of a way of taking care of your animals." The man shrugged. "She got out. Happens. I'm here to take her back." Jack raised the rifle. Not fully, just enough to be clear. "She's not going anywhere." The man's smirk faded slightly. "You don't know what you're dealing with, old man. That dog's trouble." Jack stepped forward, every inch of him coiled. "Number. Your trouble. And if you think you can waltz back here with rope in hand, like you're claiming property, you're dumber than you look." Behind him, Grace pushed the door wide with her nose. She stepped outside. Her growl split the air like thunder. Her teeth were bared, body braced to lunge, eyes burning with recognition. Not just fear. Defiance. The man stepped back. Jack saw it. The flicker of fear. Grace remembered him, and Jack understood then. This wasn't just the man who hurt her. It was the man who made her run. "You've made a mistake," the man hissed. "That dog, she'll turn on you. She's dangerous." Jack didn't flinch. "She's better than you'll ever be." The man hesitated, then turned and disappeared into the trees. Jack lowered the rifle, slowly backing into the cabin. Grace followed, but not before glancing once more into the woods, ears forward, tail high. Jack shut and bolted the door. Then he knelt and rested his forehead against her neck. "You did good, girl," he whispered. "You kept us safe." She let out a shaky breath and leaned into him, solid and warm. That night, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. They had stood together, and no one, ever again, would tear that apart. The next morning dawned clear and quiet, the kind of crisp mountain stillness that sinks deep into the bones. The sky blushed pink over the hills, and frost twinkled like glass shards across the ground. Jack stood at the porch with a mug in hand, steam curling upward like a ghost of the night before. Inside, the cabin was warm, not just from fire, but from life. Snow and ash tumbled across the rug, yipping and bumping into the old armchair. Grace lay nearby, watching them, her tail giving the occasional lazy thump. Her ears still twitched at the smallest sound, but they no longer stiffened. She listened now, not in fear, but in awareness. Jack stepped back inside, shutting the door behind him. He didn't speak right away. He simply watched them. Grace looked up at him, and for the first time, she rose without hesitation. She walked to him, head lowered slightly, not in submission, but in offering, and nudged his hand. Jack chuckled, rough and quiet. "Well, good morning to you too." He sat down cross-legged on the floor. Grace settled beside him, her head on his knee again. Ash curled against his other leg, sighing in his sleep. He looked around the room, toys made from socks, bowls half full, blankets in corners, scratches on the floor, fur on the couch. It was no longer a cabin of solitude. It was a home. And for the first time in years, Jack didn't miss the silence. The pups were growing quickly now, cheeks round, eyes bright, legs sturdier with each sunrise. Snow barked at her own shadow one afternoon, and Grace tilted her head in amusement. Jack swore he caught her smiling. He took to walking the perimeter of the land with Grace each day, boots crunching against the thawing ground, rifle slung across his back, more out of ritual than fear. Grace never left his side. She moved with confidence now, shoulders steady, head high. Whatever haunted her was behind her, mostly. Sometimes, at the edge of the woods, she still paused, but instead of freezing or growling, she would simply look, then turn away, and walk on. Jack never asked what she remembered. He didn't have to. One night, after the fire had died down, and the cabin was wrapped in shadow, Jack sat in his chair, with Grace curled at his feet and the pups tangled in sleep beside her. The air felt different, still, but full. Jack reached down, running his fingers through Grace's coat. She leaned into his touch, a quiet hum of contentment vibrating in her throat. "I don't know where you came from," he whispered, "but I'm damn glad you found me." Grace tilted her head up, her amber eyes meeting his. There was no fear in them now, no hesitation, only knowing, acceptance, family. She laid her head on his lap, her entire body at ease in a way it had never been. Jack rested his palm against her ribs, feeling the steady thump of her heart beneath his hand. She was here. She was safe. And so was he. Jack had spent so many years surviving, through fire, loss, loneliness. But Grace had taught him something different, something softer. He hadn't just rescued her. She had rescued him too. In the days that followed, their rhythm deepened. The pups grew into small, bounding shadows, with wagging tails and clumsy love. Grace watched them like a quiet queen, stern when needed, soft when earned. And Jack watched all of it with a kind of reverence he hadn't known he possessed. He wasn't alone anymore. He hadn't been since the night a frozen dog scratched at his door and changed everything. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of lavender and gold, Jack sat on the porch with Grace beside him. Snow and ash played in the yard, their barks echoing through the stillness. Jack took a long breath. "I used to think I'd already lived the best parts of my life," he murmured. Grace looked at him, then nudged his hand. Jack smiled. "Turns out I was just waiting." They sat like that for a long time. No words, no fear, just wind, warmth, and a promise written in the rhythm of a shared breath.